in a concentration camp, a ghetto called Terezin.
He's an actor, and Terezin is the longest, most poorly paid engagement of his entire life.
We've discovered and adapted a play that was written by the Jewish prisoners there during the Holocaust, during the war.
Art help to survive, help to live, help to survive.
And that's what's so magnificent about this idea of performing in the face of death.
They found a way to entertain.
You're the worst possible circumstances you could be in, and yet here's music and art and laughter. This was an attempt to give people a dream.
This is about shining some light in the ghetto that was so dark.
Shalom Aleichem, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Shmoozing with Avi. This is our Yom HaShoah edition because we have an extraordinary gentleman with us today who made an amazing documentary film about Terezin, which we'll talk about in a minute. I've actually had the pleasure and honor of reading this man's work and actually doing a reading of one of his plays, which is one of my favorites. And his name is Richard Krevolin. He is an award-winning screenwriter, author, playwright, and as a professor, over 20,000 screenwriters have been taught by him in LA and around the world. And under his guidance, his students have gone on to sell film scripts and TV shows to Universal, Fox, Paramount, DreamWorks, and very other big studios and production companies. He is a playwright. He's written many plays, including The Gospel According to Jerry, which we did a wonderful reading of, and I hope we will get to produce it next season, perhaps. He just co-wrote and directed a feature-length comedy called Attachments, starring the Academy Award-nominated actress Catherine Ross. But today, we're actually here to discuss a very specific documentary project that he wrote, directed, and produced for PBS called Making Light in Terezin. So please welcome my friend and colleague, Richard Krevolin. Richard, join us, won't you?
Okay, let me start the video. Hello, thank you.
How are you?
Good, good.
So listen, I actually saw you in person when we did the reading of Gospel According to Jerry, and it was a real pleasure to get to know you a little better. But generally, I like to find out what it is that makes you who you are. So can you tell us a little bit first, before we get into this amazing career that you've had? Can you talk about where you were born, how you grew up, why the Holocaust? Did you have relatives who were Holocaust survivors, or was your family in any way connected to the Holocaust? And how did you get to, eventually going to Yale and, and USC and UCLA and really getting into a major position in the film business?
I don't know where to begin. So I grew up in the suburbs of New Haven, Connecticut. And my father's father was actually trained in the Royal Surgeon. He was in a little shtetl in White Russia, what they called White Russia, pretty much right now, where the war is going on, which is kind of scary.
Belarus.
Yeah, and he came, so I guess it's like all of us. We live haunted lives. I always say history isn't history. History is today. There's no such thing as past, present, or future. The ghosts are among us. And so that haunting feeling of going through the family photo albums and seeing all these people who were obliterated, just if they didn't make it, by World War II, they disappeared. And so that's always been present in my mindset. I had a pretty pretty lucky life in that, I grew up in suburban Connecticut, as I said. So my father's father came to New Haven and couldn't practice. He was considered a doctor in the shtetl, but the barber surgery school goes back to the Middle Ages. And as a barber surgeon, he would have been the doctor of the shtetl, but in America, all he could do was cut hair. He couldn't, he didn't go to med school. So he cut hair in New Haven. His son, my father, was someone who said, I'll be a barber too, I'll take care of the family. And his parents said, no, you have to work hard and study. You're not going to be a barber. You're going to be something more. And he worked very, very hard, studied very hard, and received a New Haven scholarship. They give one kid a year in New Haven a free ride at Yale. And he got to go to Yale and Yale Law School. And he then gave me a life where I could try to be an artist, and had the financial stability to go to Hollywood and try. And I think it was his dream, and he kind of lived through me. He used to parade my programs around the office, and he came to all my shows and sat in the front seat, and loved theater. And so I was fortunate to have the ability to. I also went to Yale in his footsteps. And then instead of going to law school, I went to film school and moved out to Hollywood. And then my life, it was very interesting. I went to UCLA screenwriting program. They take 10 kids a year, and it's maybe considered the finest screenwriting program in the world. And yet my movies weren't being made. And instead I wrote a play called Yahrzeit, or Boy Chick, which I've mentioned to you, and you're a good age to do that now. It's a one-man show about me growing up in New Haven, and the story of my father, and it's some of it's fictional. The main character is a Holocaust survivor, which my family, fortunately, they made it, and they didn't have to experience that. But my family was very involved in the Jewish summer camp, and I got to be the driver for we called him the Camp Mosquito, who is the Mashkiach, the man who checked all the food. So the Camp Mosquito was a Holocaust survivor, and he told me about getting on a boat to America after the Holocaust and seeing a banana and eating the peel because he didn't know what a banana was, and he didn't like it very much. And then they told him, you're not supposed to eat the outside. And he told me stories of his life, and it was very close to him. And so I was always fascinated by these people who lived through the unthinkable. And then the ghosts of my family who never made it to America, and what their lives must have been like. So I wrote Yahrzeit, which is really a kind of a hymn. It's kind of a eulogy for them. And it's about growing up in New Haven and assimilation and orthodoxy and Reform Judaism. And it ended up going off Broadway as a play called Boy Chick, and was running around the time you were there with your one-man show, and Richard Klein did it. And so what ended up happening is I went to Hollywood to do screenwriting, and the world was saying, no, at least for now, you're not doing any screenwriting. You're going to write plays. And the Jewish audience supported me, and the Jewish audience was something I felt I could speak to. And, it's naturally I wrote stories about Jewish people.
So your grandfather came, I'm assuming, at the turn of the century, give or take. And he met an American woman. And so your grandmother was not an immigrant?
No, they all came from the old country. Yeah. So my dad was first generation. My mom was first generation. Right. So yeah. And they were all, in a way, not Holocaust survivors in that they lived through it, but Holocaust survivors in all of my grandparents' family that didn't come to America.
Right.
So,
right. So
that kind of thing, first generation Americans. Yeah.
And did they speak Yiddish at home?
Oh yeah.
Your parents,
especially when they got angry.
Right.
And it was weird. I was always this type of experience, like where now I didn't really, my dad's parents, I didn't know, they had all passed away. But my mom's parents, we'd go out for dinner and everyone would go, Mom, why don't you try the salmon? It looks really good. Mom, I bet you'd like, because she spoke Yiddish and never learned English, how to read English. So we had to tell her what was on the menu. Mm-hmm. And, it's just an interesting thing to, and then she would kind of say things to Grandpa in Yiddish that we wouldn't understand, so that we couldn't know what she was really thinking. And so that was interesting. And she essentially was trapped in her kitchen her whole life. And so I wrote a one-woman show about her, essentially, her daughter, cleaning up her home and going through both plays. Yortzeit, he opens up a safety deposit box, and every item he pulls out generates a story. Mm-hmm. And then the one woman show, she's in the kitchen, her mother has died, and she's cleaning out the kitchen, and everything in the kitchen she finds generates a story. So she finds a brisket from the 1970s in the freezer, and that generates a story about her brisket, so I spent many years kind of trying to look at the Jewish experience. And then when I ran out of family stories, I went to Meyer Lansky, and then, other stories, King Levine, which is a Jewish King Lear, which was kind of inspired by my next door neighbor, who was Murray Lender, who was the bagel. He had the moxie to freeze a bagel. And so I love the idea of a Jewish King Lear called King Levine, who froze the first Bialy. So it's about the frozen Bialy king of Connecticut. And Sammy Shore, who, was in Sammy Shore started the Comedy Store, played King Levine, and Shecky Green was his comedy partner. And my writing partner was Joe Bologna, who said, I know I used to write jokes for Sammy. He needs a show. Do you have any ideas? And so, it's been a kind of an extraordinary journey on all these different stories, capturing, different aspects of the Jewish experience.
How early did you start realizing that you wanted to write plays? Because you were going to be a screenwriter. So I
was going to be a lawyer. I was going to be a lawyer. And then I literally pivoted at the last second and said, I can't sit in the law office my whole life. I ended up, I do a lot of consulting now, narrative consulting for lawyers, where I help lawyers tell stories in the courtroom. So I got to actually do a lecture for the Connecticut Bar Association that my father attended. And it was one of the most wonderful kind of full circle moments of my life, because for years they thought I was wasting my life because I was in Hollywood writing and making no money. And it's brutal trying to break in as an artist and a writer. And so I kept getting the question, when are you going to law school? When are you going back? But I couldn't, although the theater, I think in the end, if I ended up as a litigator, I might have loved the theater of the courtroom, which, you know, I know you've played a lawyer, you know, and that idea of having that captive audience of jury members and the lawyer who wins tells the best story in the courtroom. I mean, it's that simple. So, you know, I've just been, I did go through, my mom is in she sold our family home after my father passed. And she said, you've got a month to get all your stuff if you want it. And I went through all my stuff, which was always extraordinary. And I found an Abbott and Costello script I wrote when I was 7. So I was watching Abbott and Costello and writing scripts about what might happen if they had a different adventure with Frankenstein or something. So I've been writing my whole life, but I was thinking I was going to write as a lawyer. And then the reality of law school hit, and I spent a year after Yale at home writing and trying to get into film school. And basically my parents said, if you get into film school in this screenwriting program, they only take 10 people. If they take you, then you should go. If not, you should go to law school. But, you know, you get a master's degree and so what? You know, that doesn't guarantee you anything. So I spent the next 10 years writing and trying to support myself as a teacher of writing, and then things, and that shift from, are you going to go to law school, till when is your play opening off Broadway happened, and that allowed.
But in the middle of all that, you had over 20,000 students.
Right. So I was fortunate. I never really left USC. So it's confused. I applied to USC and UCLA, the two best writing programs, and I got into both. So I didn't know what to do. UCLA is a state school and it's cheaper. So USC is quite expensive. So I went to the head of USC, the program there, and I said, look, I'm going to UCLA. I can't afford USC. And he said, oh, why didn't you tell me? I'll get you a teaching fellowship. So I said, you get me a teaching fellowship, I'll come. So next thing I know, I got a free ride at USC. And I didn't want to say no to UCLA, so I went to both at the same time. And one was for playwriting and one was for screenwriting, and was able to do that. Graduate degrees are fun. You're doing what you love. It's not hard. You're writing plays and movies and getting feedback. So Jerome Lawrence, who wrote Inherit the Wind and you know, plays like that, was my mentor in playwriting. And then in screenwriting, I worked with people like Sterling Silliphant, who wrote In the Heat of the Night, first man ever to get $1 million for a screenplay. And I couldn't resist, you know, having that opportunity, and the teaching fellowship was so wonderful. I enrolled in the PhD program at USC just to keep my fellowship alive. And then they ended up just giving me classes. And so ended up having these extraordinary students, you know, like John M. Chu, the guy who directed In the Heights and is directing Wicked. John M. Chu was one of my writing students. So I had hundreds and hundreds of writing students at USC. And then I started writing books on writing and touring around the country and the world, teaching about writing and having students in Moscow and in Kenya, you know, and then I started working with brands and having students in advertising, teaching them how to tell stories for products, and then working with lawyers how to. So I just am open. I've always vowed to. I plan, but they say, you know, you plan and God laughs. But you plan on doing one thing, and if a window opens somewhere else, I flow with it. And so, and you got to pay the rent. So if lawyers want to help me pay the rent, I'll work with lawyers. If, you know, I was working with Bacardi Rum, and they own a lot of different companies. They own a whiskey company that's made in Dunsinane Castle, the castle where the Thane of Cawdor lives, you know, and they wanted to bring Shakespeare in. When you drink whiskey, you're drinking the story of the whiskey. So they flew me there to go to the castle and help them write a story about their whiskey. So, you know, it's just been, I look back, I'm sitting by my pool in Florida, kind of semi-retired, and have had these incredible experiences in these different places. You know, they flew me. It's just great, you know, and I'm a very lucky man.
And in some ways, the opportunities are beginning again. You know, now in some ways, your plays are finding new lives. Your works are you know, being discovered. You're still consulting, I'm sure. Tell me a little bit before we get into like Terezin and the more serious work. You know, when you think of your childhood and your adolescence and even your adult life, you know, I'm always fascinated by what people think is Jewish, you know, because you have found an enormous voice in expressing Jewish art through theater, through film, through your work. But I wonder, when you think back on your childhood and your adolescence, how Jewish, you know, what was your Jewish quotient? What was your JQ, so to speak? You know, was it Orthodox, conservative, Reform? Did you bother, you know, did you celebrate the holidays? How did you know, what was your, how Jewish were you guys?
My dad came from a pretty serious Jewish, his father, you know, Orthodox, but not, you know, I guess would be kind of modern American Orthodox. My dad and mom, you know, had me go to Hebrew school in a conservative temple. And the biggest laugh in Yortzite's the laugh, you know, where the kid says, "Dad, I'm not going. I hate organized religion." And the father says, "Come, you'll see it's not that well organized," you know, and you know, and that really, that play kind of dealt with the guilt and the struggle of someone who deeply associates myself as being Jewish, but doesn't go to temple anymore, doesn't keep kosher, and has a lot of issues with organized religion. Have spent a lot of, you know, time with Erwin talking about this, Erwin Ucla, who, you know, wrote that play with me. And he's the kind of rabbi I like hearing his sermons, and I'll go to his temple. But it's interesting. So I'm pushing away my Judaism, yet all I do is write plays that are deeply entrenched. And I'm obsessed with the Seinfeld show and, you know, stand-up comedians and the Jewish culture and food. I just literally flew back the red eye, and I had 24 bagels with me because they make flagels. Have you had flagels?
No.
So Larry King opened up a place called Brooklyn Water Bagel in Los Angeles, and he imports the water from Brooklyn to make the bagels.
Right.
You know, and there's the whole myth of the New York water. And then he makes this thing. It's a special order. It's a flagel. It's a flat. I got to grab one and show you just a second. It's a flat.
A flat bagel is called a flagel, apparently. And it sounds to me like another word for a bialy.
Look at the size of this thing.
Oh my God, look at that. Wow.
You know, and it's a flagel. And so and you can't put it in your luggage because then all your clothes smell of garlic forever. And your luggage, you have to literally throw out your luggage. So I had to carry it on. And, and so it's like I'm obsessed with food and Jewish humor. And so I'm deeply Jewish, but the temple is something where I have a lot of problems with a lot of the orthodoxy. And so my work deals with this contradiction and this tension.
But Richard, it's not a contradiction. One of the things we have not learned through history is that Jews have always, from, going back, for hundreds, if not thousands of years, you've had your Orthodox and you've had your less Orthodox and you've had your secular and you had your communists and you had your anarchists. And there were always Jews, especially in the 1880s, back in the 1800s. So there's not a contradiction here. We've become obsessed with Judaism as a religion, when really Judaism is much more than just a religion. It is also a religion, but it's also a culture that has changed the world. And that's really where I come from, because I was brought up an atheist. My father came out of Auschwitz and said, there is no God, and if there is, I don't want to have anything to do with it. So, as we look at, Ukraine, and once again, we start to ask, where is God?
Well, before, let me just say something, because, eventually we're going to get to this. And what was one of the great eye-opening, so I interviewed a lot of survivors to do this, and we'll talk about that. But the thing that was stunning to me was they all said the same thing, like what you just said, which is they obviously were Jewish, they're survivors of the Holocaust, but they rejected that. They didn't want to go to temple. They didn't tell their children that they were Jewish. It's this extraordinary response to the Holocaust where you push away your Judaism, which makes complete sense, obviously.
Right, unless you embrace your Judaism in a different way, which is what you've done, and what I've done, and many of us have done. And I wish more would acknowledge, for instance, if I understand correctly, there's a museum of film in Los Angeles, a museum of the motion picture industry. And apparently there's no discussion of the original Jews who created the great studios who all spoke Yiddish. There's no mention of the Yiddish film business. There's no mention of the Judaism that created the film industry. So, we kind of forget things, and it's up to people like you and me to remember. And that's kind of brings us to the segue of talking about remembering, because never forget, right? Never forget, never again is now. Here we are living in a world where we're watching a repeat of certain things that have already happened in history, and now we're watching them again and wondering, how do we respond? So tell us about how you have found your place in telling these stories, and especially with Making Light in Terezin. And for those who don't know, what was Terezin and why was it so special?
Well, it's funny because none of this, so Making Light, none of this would have happened without Jerry, because when I mentioned Jerry, so this is The Gospel According to Jerry is a two-person play about a rabbi who essentially falls in love with an African-American gospel singer, and the tension of that relationship and the learning that happens between those two people. And that was written with Ucla. That was produced at the Minnesota Jewish Theater. So I'm there. We're having dinner, the actors, the director, and I during rehearsals. And they are talking about going to Prague. And I was fascinated by that. Why are you going to Prague? And they go, well, we've been working with the Playwrights Center in Minneapolis. And we have a scholar who discovered a cabaret piece that was done in the attic in Terezin in 1942, 43. And it's been translated. And this director is, the next thing she's going to do is direct this cabaret piece in the same attic in Terezin. And they're bringing all the survivors that exist to witness this play, which none of them got to see when they were there, when they were little kids. And the man, Pavel Stronsky, who wrote some of the lyrics to the songs, is a docent there now. And he's never seen, he wrote the lyrics, was shipped to Auschwitz, survived, and then 50 years later, he's going to get to see the play he missed because he was on a train to Auschwitz. And I'm sitting there like getting goosebumps and saying, I want to go. And you need to document this. And they go, well, we don't live in LA and have a crew. And, and I go, well, I can get a crew. And they go, have you ever directed a documentary film? And I'm like, no, but I'm going to do it now. Or, if you give me the rights to follow you, let's follow you guys to Prague. And let's get the survivors who would come to talk about their experiences. And let's document this once in a lifetime moment where this play is being staged on the very same stage that it was originally performed. And just the idea, and I was like, I had to stop the idea that the Nazis invited the Jews to do theater in the attic was extraordinary to me. And the Nazis never came up to edit or censor the work. They were free to do whatever they wanted in the attic. And it tied into the Potemkin village idea. Have you ever heard of the Potemkin village concept? So that's the concept that it's all theater. So whenever the Red Cross or anybody would come to Terezin, they would give the Jews back their clothes. They'd give them food. They'd let them appear as if they were living happy, successful lives in this little village of Terezin. And then as soon as the Red Cross left, they take the clothes away, they take the food away, and they gave them scripts even of what to say if the Red Cross asked them, how are you? It was scripted, it was theater. So that's the Potemkin village idea. And part of that was, oh, look, they're doing plays upstairs. How bad can it be? They're able to entertain themselves. And so it's just this extraordinary moment of theater within theater. And these people, to think that Pavel Stronsky, the guy who wrote this, is still alive, I want to meet him. And so we took the camera crew and we went. And what you're seeing is I'm holding up the DVD, but I'm also holding this up because what happened is the movie's 80 minutes long. The PBS documentary was 50 minutes long. And I had 40 hours of the most extraordinary interviews and stories I'd ever heard. And when you're sitting there talking to Pavel and he's telling you that he was a school teacher in Auschwitz and Mengele, the angel of death, would walk into his classroom and take children and bounce them on his knee, say hi to Uncle Joe, okay? And so I'm sitting next to a man who sat in a classroom with Joseph Mengele. So that, it was extraordinary. And then he tells me, why did he bounce them on his knee? He was testing their strength to do medical experiments on them. And then these children would disappear from the classroom. So I'm hearing all these stories. So then I compiled verbatim every word of every interview, and that somebody had to do more than just do a documentary, have a published record of all these people's stories before it was too late. And of course, as soon as I finished, Pavel died, everybody's gone. These were elderly people. And so it's just this extraordinary moment. And I happen to have been recently divorced and kind of depressed and needed a project to grab hold of. And it fell in my lap. And I hired a crew, which was basically one very gifted cameraman. And I held the lights and the sound. And I mean, it was skeleton, and I slept for a week in the barracks in Terezin, and you sleep with the ghosts. It's a very strange energy to be in there. And it's a town. There are Czech citizens who live there. That's where they live. It's extraordinary. Have you been? Have you been there?
I have been,
Okay.
and of course, I did a lot of work in Dachau as well as Auschwitz, and I've been involved in this Dachau project for several years. But it is amazing to me. Well, two things that you said really triggered. One is that the Nazis were always interested in the Potemkin village concept, that they had to be able to show people who came in from the outside how great it was. Dachau, I have pictures from Dachau that the Nazis were giving out to the Red Cross that said, look, they have barracks, they have blankets, they have pillows, each one has a locker. Look, in their lockers, they have forks and knives and plates and cups and mugs, and it's really great. In Terezin, they used to give the kids balls and say, go play ball, and show, the Red Cross how beautiful it was. It was like a summer camp. So, that element to me is horrific, needless to say.
Well, but it's interesting because, I'm not going to get political here, but we have fake news and misinformation every day. And it's the same thing. I mean, this is something that we need to be able to see through if we are to survive. And so it's very topical, that idea.
And the second thing that you said, which I find even more fascinating, and I think your film really talks to this, and I'd like to hear more from you about it, which is the idea that in order to survive, the Jews and others, not only Jews, but the Jews primarily in terms of my knowledge, really had to express themselves in more than just survival mode. They wrote plays, they wrote concerts, they wrote operas, they performed, even not only in Terezin, where they were given the permission to create because they wanted to create this facade, but even in Vilna and Lodz, Indecent, the play Indecent talks about how the theater group was up in the attic doing theater for those who were still in the ghetto. Vilna is very famous for writing plays that the Nazis would see and approve, but it was done in code. So that if the actor said, there are 12 bagels at the bakery, the underground knew that meant there were 12 guns behind the bakery. So, there was this constant need to be creative. Can you talk about making light in Terezin?
Well, it's exactly what this movie is about. the subtitle of the movie, so making light, is this idea of, because it's a comedy. So there's this lightness in the face of death. But one of the survivors who the film is actually dedicated to, who passed very quickly after this, and I don't want to give everything away, but he has this sentence that he says, he's speaking in Czech, so I didn't even know he said it until the translator did the translation. And then I got to read the transcriptions, and he talked about it, and it's 3 simple words. He said, for us, it was art versus death, and they talk about being hungry, but when you're creating art, you're not hungry anymore, so it's an extraordinary moment. And they made these extraordinary choices and this looks at comedy a lot, the role that comedy played in their lives to help them survive. And music, I mean, this was a musical theater piece, kind of a classic barroom cabaret piece. So you had some very gifted modern day artists, writers, musicians, a man named Craig Harris, really talented guy, found what he called the lead sheets. So they found some notes that were played, and he created songs out of that with the lyrics that were then performed. And to see this idea, and I've had problems with my documentary because people have pushed back. What right? I've had people after screenings point at me. What right do you have to show people laughing and singing in the Holocaust? And I was like, look, I'm not making anything up. I'm telling an incredible story of the choice that these people made to try to laugh and live and survive through art in the Holocaust. And it's not a narrative that people are comfortable with. It's not a narrative that fits the presiding narrative of, it's the same that the narrative, Warsaw Ghetto is a narrative we like. There was a rebellion there. That's a positive narrative. But you also have the sheep going to the slaughter narrative. And this is an anti-sheep narrative. This is about, hey, I don't have a gun, so how do I fight back? I can fight back with music. I can fight back with dance. I can fight back with comedy, because those are things I can do. And that's a beautiful sentiment. So it's an extraordinary moment. And you also have to realize, probably in the history of the world, there was no greater concentration of incredibly talented and gifted artists, musicians, and writers than in Theresienstadt in that moment. Because basically they took all the intelligentsia and the musicians and they put them there to show the world, look at what we're doing. So it was literally that. I never understood, what does the word concentration camp mean? They concentrated the most brilliant people of that generation in this one place. But at any moment, they could be shipped to Auschwitz. So it's an extraordinary, and so you have a choice. Do I sing and dance and write, knowing that tomorrow I could be gone? And so that's why Pavel's story, he didn't even get to see what he wrote, is so extraordinary. And then to get to interview him after 50 years later, when he does get to see it, and he's crying and I'm crying, and he's a beautiful man who met his wife, at this time, and they got separated. And so he becomes the main character in the movie, and his love story is the thread that holds the movie together. So,
can you tell us a little bit about the show itself that they did, that he wrote?
Yeah, the show was written, so the children of the guy who wrote the show are interviewed, and they found some of these scripts and documents in a desk, so imagine your father passes, just like the play I was talking about. In Yard Site, you open up a safety deposit box, you pull something out, boom. Father dies, they open up a desk drawer and they find a script. Now they didn't know their dad was a playwright. They find a script and they realize it's from 1942. So this is but the writer who ended up writing this script took the translated Czech script, but then wrote a play about people discovering. So it's like another play within a play. There's a scholar who discovers this script, and then we see sketches from the script. So one of the most famous sketches is them. It's what I call the teleportation time travel sketch. So they're wearing their clothes with the Jewish star, the yellow star, but it's 50 years in the future and they're living a good life. And they talk about, oh, what is that? It's all about memory. Oh, many years ago, this was the high fashion to wear this star. And I'm getting chills, and it's comedy, but see, what's the genius of that? You're in the Holocaust, but you're transporting yourself to a future when you can make jokes about these yellow stars. So that allows you to live. That allows you to smile. So it's a hard thing to watch. It's a comedy that no one wants to laugh at. So audiences, it's not a play that anyone really wants to watch or produce. So what I do is take snippets of the most powerful moments of the play and intercut that with the interviews of the people. Because the play is just so hard it's so sad on a core level, so hard to watch. But yet, and some of the music is beautiful. And so it's just an interesting thing to have to experience this as someone who, now looking back. And then, so I tried to experience it through the eyes of the survivors who, have their take on what they saw. But it was a comedy that no one really laughed at. It's a musical that no one wanted to sing along to. So it's a problematic piece of theater in this day and age. And it wasn't theater done by theater professionals. But people like Jan Fischer, who I was talking about, never directed until he got to Theresienstadt, and then spent his life as a theater director as a result of his love for theater, which was blossoming there. So it's just a very difficult piece. And people liked watching the survivor interviews probably more than the play, because it was just tricky and difficult to see.
And more important than ever. See, to me, and we are so lucky that you were able to grab this footage before these people passed away, and we lost this story. But more importantly now than ever, especially in light of what's happening in the world today, we have to learn how survival, what is this human survival instinct that goes to the arts, that goes to the creativity, that goes to laughter, to fight the pain, to live with joy in spite of the incredibly depressing reality that was right outside the door. As long as you could close the door and be in that stage, like you said, you weren't hungry.
Yeah, it was amazing. The scholar who did the translations, Dr. Lisa Peschel, she started all this because she saw the children's drawings from Theresienstadt. So that's visual art. Visual art started everything for her and brought her, and she ended up doing her PhD and dedicating her life to this. And then at the same time that I'm interviewing these people, I tried to interview this guy and he said, I can't do this interview. And I said, why? And he goes, well, I'm the star of this other movie called Requiem about the opera that was written in the basement. So they did symphonies in the basement and operas, and they did cabaret and theater in the attic. So to think about all of the extraordinary amount of culture. But, you know, if you think about it, God forbid it ever happens. But, you know, as Jews, we always think about I was just talking to my friend who said their grandmother had a packed suitcase never used her oven her whole life. Why? Because that's where she kept her packed suitcase so that she could grab the suitcase and escape and survive, because she came out of that mentality. And I know, and the revelation I think I had, and the revelation I'm sure you would have in the same experience, if you or I, by grace of God, we're not, but you and I were there, what would we do? We'd do the same thing. We'd be doing shows, entertaining each other, making jokes. What else could we do? I mean,
I honestly don't know whether I would have been able to survive. I think of what my father went through, and I don't know whether I could have, in any way, shape, or form, been able to live like that, through that. But I don't know. You know, the human survival instinct is the strongest instinct, apparently, and we all find ways to survive if we can. But I am immensely fascinated by the idea that we found creativity in the midst of the most horrific world that man can imagine, that we found a way to be creative. And that to me is amazing. You know, we're running out of time. I could talk to you about this for another 5 hours easily, because there are 10 projects already in my head that I'm familiar with, that deal. There was vaudeville in the camps, in the Vilna ghetto in Lithuania. There was actually a vaudeville that they had with unbelievable.
Well, I think that's that's the reference when you see these cabaret pieces they're doing. The reference you make is that feels like vaudeville pieces, right. So it is very similar.
Yeah,
but they're doing numbers together, you know. Yeah.
Can you tell us where can we find the book? Where can we find the book?
Well, so yeah, I mean, this is on Amazon, obviously. There's a and you get to see pictures and all the interviews verbatim, every word that from every person. And you can just get if you're a reader and you want to read the full story, that's on Amazon. You know, I think you can, the DVD, I don't even know if the DVD exists anymore. Everything is streaming. But if you have Tubi, you can stream it for free, actually. You can, but the easiest thing is you can rent it on Amazon for like $2.99 and watch it. You get 48 hours to watch it, or you can buy it. It's no longer, I don't know if PBS might end up showing it, but that's probably the easiest. You literally just type in Making Light in Terezin and you'll see all these options that come up.
What's up next for you, Richard? And you know, how can we help?
Well, it's an interest, you know, we're talking about art. I did a non-Jewish project. I did a story of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass and their relationship. And that looks like it's going to be produced on Juneteenth at the Lincoln Theater in Washington, D.C.,
Oh, wow.
which is exciting. But, you know, the thing and then I just finished a play based on my high school experiences and things about a Jewish kid in high school who stars in, and this, I should say my high school is kind of like my high school, but in this play, they do a production of Our Town that goes horribly, horribly wrong. And the whole town goes crazy. And I recently discovered that Thornton Wilder is buried in a cemetery right next to the town that I went to high school with. And so the ghost of Thornton Wilder's in the play as well. And it is interesting how the main character is a teenage Jewish kid and his mother, and how, but the town is very New England, not Jewish. And that tension kind of drives the show. And that's something obviously you and I have been talking about, and hopefully, and like the original Our Town, it's done very presentationally. So I'm hoping that is something that gets published and is done by high schools all across the country. And then also community theaters gets to do it. Have you ever played the stage manager in Our Town?
I have not. I've always wanted to, and I've never had the.
Well, this is so the stage there's a stage manager in this play, so this might be your big opportunity there.
Sounds like a perfect.
Yeah, so it's fun. Thank you.
Good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I couldn't be more proud to know this man, and I couldn't be more excited to be able to present his work anytime, any way we can. We always commemorate Yom HaShoah, so please stay tuned for all of our programming, not only during this commemoration time, but all year round. We have Yiddish fests and Hanukkah fests and Purim fests, and we celebrate Jewish culture in every way we can at whyilovejewish.org. So thank you so much for watching. Richard, thank you so much for being a part of it. And we'll see you soon.